speaking of other markets, Matt,
Mm-hmm.
I like this transition. Okay, markets best suited for investment in 2025. Now, this John Burns Research Consulting put out a list, and it's not necessarily the best markets, we'd say, but it's some markets that you had a couple different takes.
Yeah.
The headline is, where will new home construction go beyond the usual hotspots? And they call the usual hotspots California, Florida, Texas, Georgia, Arizona, and New York. We're talking about some other MSAs that I would call these all, relatively large, but are kind of maybe the up and coming construction boom markets.
Yeah.
But your point, Matt, when we were talking about this piece before, is you're like, these aren't necessarily the markets that you want to jump into
Yeah.
just because, they're building new housing units, which means there's some demand, but you also need to watch out because they're building more units.
Yeah, I will admit, like, as I started gathering these, I gathered it quickly. I was like, oh, no, this is interesting, and from skimming the article, you almost jump to the conclusion that these home construction growth equals housing demand, because it does kind of connect the two implicitly. They have the numbers of housing permits and for single family and multifamily, but then they follow that by a list of like the demand drivers. For instance, they talk about Charlotte that ranks seventh in permit activity, and then they follow it with Charlotte's strong banking and finance sector continues to attract high-paying jobs. Now that's great. And then they say, in response to rising housing demand, developers are shifting focus to multifamily as infrastructure struggles to keep up. That's fine, but you don't get the numbers. And if you looked at the numbers, you would see that Charlotte is one of the more overbuilt markets. Yeah. And we're going to talk long-term, short-term. That means it's going to be a short-term oversupply and maybe has long-term legs. But if you're going to trend weather, that means probably for the next 2 or 3 years, Charlotte's probably going to be oversupplied. That would be my guess.
Yeah. Just circling back to what we were just talking about, if we do see a further reduction in new supply in these markets, that could, if that happens, that could be what some of these now high supply markets could really need.
Yeah.
And some of those developers may be saved because all of a sudden, you're building a lot right now, but because there's a lot of demand.
Yeah.
If we can't build anymore because it's too expensive, that inventory most likely will be absorbed faster than if we have a further glut of new inventory, because let's say that rates come down and tariffs aren't that impactful and housing cost and the cost to build stays the same or even comes down a little. Let's just say it stays the same. We're probably going to build a lot more, housing units.
Yep.
And those markets are not going to perform as well from an investment standpoint in terms of like rent growth and all of that. Now for residents, for renters, that would be a good thing, because we want the supply to keep on cranking. Yeah. We want to keep on going. And so, again, this is where it's the tale of two cities, and it's how we're looking at it. The conversation that you and I are having is different from those of like city leaders of how are we dealing with this affordability crisis and housing availability, and they need to keep building in these markets.
They say there's a lot of housing demand. There's also a lot of housing supply. And that was what my thought is like, that's great. They are going to build and they're meeting that demand. My question is, are we getting to this point, and like you kind of mentioned before, because of the lower supply, are we getting to this point where that permit activity, that's relevant, but also the strong job sector, or the strong economy, the strong, what did they say, banking and finance sector, that's equally relevant. But I keep going back to the past 2 years, all we talked about was supply. That was basically the only relevant thing you had to follow because we were building so much. But now that things are coming into balance, well, you got to follow banking and finance now, or at least makes it more interesting.
And that's how it typically often is. You're always looking at supply.
Yeah, and you don't want to do it like in a really, really like dismal market too. Sorry.
Yeah. You don't want to invest in. It's always a balance. You want to invest in a market. You want to invest in a market that's growing, but not growing so fast that it's attracting every developer to build an added glut of new supply. Definitely true. You don't want to go to a market that's just declining also for too long, because even though you might be the only game in town, at some point, playing hot potato, and you're going to be in a market that at the value of that asset is actually
Yeah.
declining or trading at a higher cap rate.
What I do think about this is there's
How many
a
think that these permits will actually be built too? I mean, just because it's permanent doesn't mean it's going to be built.
very, very good point. And for a while, I just I lacked the statistical number manipulation experience but maybe I'll run it through ChatGPT, but to find what's the attrition rate, I guess, of a permit. Do 80% of all permits issued end up in completions, or is it 50%?
RealPage has done some research on that.
Okay, I'll have to. Yeah,
but that's
I need to look
often
that up.
in the difference between different supply forecasts
Mm-hmm.
is the assumption on permit attrition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that would be interesting to see that number fluctuate over time, and maybe, arguably, the tariffs are going to be one of those disruptors that increases the permit attrition.
Yeah, exactly. It made sense. You got the permits, and all of a sudden the cost went up by 30%, 40%. I mean, costs often, in the pandemic were going up by 15 to 30% of construction costs. So it's not outside of the realm of possibility by any means. And just an example, going back to, again, sort of similar time period of where we went from high supply to low supply relative to kind of a stagflationary environment, weakening dollar. Going back to this theme, 1985 to 1991, we went from a peak of multifamily deliveries of 650,000 annually to only 175,000 units annually between 1985 to 1991. So it's over, basically a 5-6 year period. So it can take a while long to get through that cycle.
Yeah.
But we also started seeing a lot of rent growth during that at the latter half of that 5-year cycle as well. So again, that's just an example in history. It's really not the same, but
But it's it's an interesting
a rhyming example.
Yeah. That's really interesting. In the timing of that cycle too, of it takes about 5 years for things and we're right now going down that hill, I guess.
Yeah, patience is a virtue right now.